Hi, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jared Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. This week I am talking to the great Michael Rock, who, of course, is the co-founder and creative director at 2x4 in New York City, where he's worked on projects from Prada to Kanye West. And if that's not enough, he is also a professor at Columbia in their architecture department and writes regularly about design in the widest sense for the New York Times T magazine. This is a really exciting and special episode for me. Michael's work has perhaps influenced how I think about design more than anyone else, and I've admired his career for a long time as both a designer and a writer. His book, Multiple Signatures, which came out a couple years ago in 2013, unsettled me in the best way possible, and I can't tell you how many times I take it off my shelf to refer to it. In many ways, I credit it with being one of the main reasons why I decided to go back to graduate school, so I could kind of think about design at a deeper level. I visited 2x4 back in July and got to spend some time with Michael to talk about this hybrid practice as a designer and a writer. And we also talked about the state of design criticism and the importance of theory and thinking deeply within and around graphic design. So like I said, this is a very special one for me. Michael is incredibly smart and articulate, and I really appreciate him taking time out of his schedule to talk with me. I know I learned so much from this conversation. I find myself thinking about the things he talked about often, so I hope you get as much from it as I did. So here is my conversation with Michael Rock. The kind of main reason that I wanted to talk to you specifically is, one, your writing has had a kind of big influence on my development as a designer from very early on. And I think you're one of the few people from like an outside view looking at your career, one of the few people that has kind of maintained a consistent design and writing practice. You can probably count the number of designers working today who have done that, and the number of designers who have done it at the time that you've done it, I think, gets even smaller. And so I thought just kind of like a good way to start, just to kind of like set the stage, is how did that kind of start for you? Was it kind of design for? Was it design first or writing first, or how did those things kind of come together?
Right, I understand the question. I think that when I was undergraduate, I was studying English literature, and my focus was on modern poetry. And when you look at modern poetry, English and American modern poetry, it starts to have a very strong visual component to it, in the sense that where words happen on the page and things like that become an important section of that. And so as you break away from conventional structures of poetry to things which were intentionally made to overthrow those structures, it takes several different routes. And so on one level you have like the imagist poets who were specifically trying to describe visual things. And then on another level you had basically the kind of modern, the historical avant-garde movements of futurism and surrealism and things like that. That was really thinking about the visualization of poetry itself. So I started off with that, and I was spending a lot of time thinking about that, and I went from there to, and at the same time I was studying art and doing painting and things like that. And so when I went to graduate school at RISD, it was already something that was very natural thing that I was interested in words. I thought of myself as someone who studied literature more than I thought of myself as a designer at that point. And so but the idea of visualization of language was my into that.
Okay, interesting.
But then, I have to say, for a long time, I didn't feel very much like a designer, and I always felt somewhat on the outside of that, because I always felt I had this somewhat academic interest in design, and I was uncertain, maybe to an extent, about the design I would make myself somehow. And I think it takes a while for yourself to imagine yourself as a designer in a way, like that you have those skills or those qualities. And so maybe in a way, as a form of compensation, in the beginning, I tried to very much immerse myself in being a designer and making design, and I stopped writing at that point to a certain extent, and was really like thinking about practicing in a strong way. Though very quickly on after graduate school, I started teaching, and I was teaching specifically at RISD and what was essentially the semiotics program there. So I was still doing a lot of reading and research and thinking about that.
And so when you were a student there, was that when you were kind of abandoned?
Yeah, I think to a certain extent. No, I mean, I was still interested in those things, but I think I was trying really hard to learn how to be a designer. You know? And I was, there's something that can happen, and I think that I see it in my students all the time too, which is that when you're a little bit out of place and uncertain, you can hold on to your otherness,
Mm-hmm.
like, I'm not a really good designer because I'm a this or that,
Right.
And I could see that happening to myself, which is that I would hold myself apart because I thought of myself not really a designer. I hadn't gone to art school. I didn't do these things, and so, so you can. Your outsiderness becomes part of your persona to a certain extent. So I was really trying to actively break that down and be like, I really am a designer and I really want to be a designer, and I think that I over-indexed on the visual for a while, and kind of really playing with the forms of graphic design because I was trying to really invest in that and become part of that community. And I would say that I practiced design, and then I worked for a couple different studios, and then a friend of mine from RISD and I opened a design studio in Boston, and that's when I started thinking about writing again about what I was doing, because I was starting to think about in a reflexive way about the work that we're making, and also I started to think about the industry of design and some things that kind of irritated me about it, or I didn't like, or I thought there's a kind of stupidity to some of the discourse around it that I wanted to engage, or something it made me mad because I was like, oh, this is like the writing was so bad in general, and I was just like, and I also felt like there was this kind of lack. There was like this missing thing, and the more I practiced design, I thought it was so strange because there was almost like silence around it as a subject.
Interesting.
And and I think that the when there was like writing about advertising, there was writing about architecture, there was writing about these other things, but no one, of course some people were, but no one was really writing about what I thought like the real material of design was, like the actual, like no one wrote about typography, for instance, as a subject, and it's almost like no one knew how to write about it or something like that. And so the first thing I wrote public was I wrote this response to an interview that was in Print magazine between Tibor Kalman and Charles Duffy. And it was because I felt like the conversation between them totally missed the point. Like they were talking this kind of surface level, and that there was this deep level which they actually were both reinforcing, and they were missing it. And so I think you have to understand also the context that I was educated in, which is a little bit different, which is that I came into political consciousness at a time when structuralism and semiotics and then post-structuralism were extremely relevant in the academy at that time, and they were really that was the prevalent way that we would think about the world. And so I wanted to see things as representations of deeper structures somehow. And one of the reasons that I often went back to Barth at the time was that when I was interested in the work that Barth had done in the 50s writing for newspapers, if you look at the models of the three big models versus Saussure, Marx, and Freud, that all of those were models basically of which then you tried to find in the real world applications of that model, right? So you establish basically first the situation, and then you try to figure out if the model works, and then you keep doing it. And so that I wanted to try to take that approach somewhat, in my own modest way, because like I'm not art, and I'm not maybe the same people, but but then to apply that to design itself. And so
that's interesting.
So I started to write a few things, these kind of early pieces, and in a way I almost in this kind of weird reversal in the way that I came in design feeling like I wasn't a designer, I then started to feel like I wasn't a writer,
Yeah.
and so somehow I was always like on the wrong side of it, and I wasn't sure, like I didn't, I kind of wasn't that confident in terms of that writing was something that I had something to say, first of all, and that I could write well or something like that, and so that kind of came back to me slowly, and so then when I went to Yale. I moved from Boston back to Yale, and I started teaching full time. So then, I got really involved, obviously, in the development of what would become the way. Because when I came to Yale, I came the year after Sheila came there, and I was really wanted to reform what the thesis had become at Yale, and so I spent a lot of time working on the pedagogy of the school at that point, and thinking about teaching, and also as in a super rich academic environment, and it was at the height of identity politics and a lot of things that were going on there, and it was just like incredibly active time for thinking about all these issues, right?
Yeah.
And that also into thinking about that these theories could be applied to all of the products of popular culture, like not just books and movies, but that all of these things would be objects to study. But even in that case, again, design was always somehow absent, because I think that it was such an obscure profession, but also it hadn't gone through the huge explosion that it went through subsequently, and it hadn't been like, there weren't people who were practicing it outside of probably like Rand or something like that, who kind of wrote about it in a detailed way. There weren't people who practiced it who were also being reflective about it.
Yeah.
So then I started, from just that thing I'd written for Print Magazine, G. Perlman called me and said that they were redoing ID Magazine, and they were starting over, and they wanted to have a regular design critic, and what I was interested in. So when I took that job, what was good about it was that it just demanded that I'd write one thing a month.
Okay.
And I had to come up with an idea and write it.
Yeah.
And that's like really good practice, because you have 1,500 words, and you do it, you come up with a subject, and then you come up with a take on it. And so it just got me into the rhythm of writing again about, looking at the world and trying to find evidence of this model in the world, right? So you have a model in mind, and then you look for evidence of it, and then you play that out in all these different ways.
And at this time, you're teaching at Yale.
I was teaching full time.
Are you design?
Yeah, I was designing. Also, Susan, my partner, and I were designing. She was a graduate student at the time in the American Studies department, which was also really influential, because she was an academic program looking at subjects, and she was writing her thesis at the time on typographic unions, on labor practices in typographic unions. So
this is interesting.
And it was this really rigorous program she was in. She was working with David Montgomery, who's probably the greatest labor historian in the world, and so looking at again, like typography, but really in this kind of deep historical way of looking at typography. And so she was looking at Big Six, which was the typographic union in New York at the time, and so there were just like all these factors that I think were really influencing the way of thinking about writing, and so I would say that period was really influenced by that way of thinking about design. And so then when we moved to New York to start the studio, because she decided she wasn't going to finish her PhD, that we were going to work instead, and so we came here, and I think that I was really curious about now starting a business,
right.
And then you get involved in a whole bunch of other stuff, like junk in front of your business. Yeah. And I think for a long time, just getting that going and making work and doing all the things that you like, learning again to be a designer, but now we're learning to run a business, stuff like that, take over. But then there's a whole nother phase of writing, I think, that happened, which the writing that started to influence the work we were doing. So like writing really specifically for the work, and that went everything from sometimes copywriting to sometimes writing presentations, sometimes writing brand things, sometimes writing text for films or scripts or things like that. And so writing just became a really natural part of what I did, and increasingly it became a really important part of what the studio did, because providing, if you're only designer, then oftentimes you don't have as much influence, whereas if you're obviously writing the content and you're writing the strategies, you take on more and more control of it. And so the fact that I was, I always saw it in a way separate, which is I wrote as a critic and I made a design, and then the work came together, and then writing became a product of the studio, right? Like it was one of the things that we make, and and then that way I don't see it as any, like, now they're so deeply entwined. The product of the studio is both design systems and words, and oftentimes the place where they, and that's what we sell. Like that's the thing we sell. And so so it became really, started off with really simple things like writing, a presentation or something like that, like playing with words and images to make a point that you're doing, and the whole sole purpose of that is to propose an idea or something like that. And then to much more, things now where we write, really detailed kind of strategy things, and where we're getting paid to provide the words or the language for something. And then, the criticism part came back again, because then I started to have opportunities to write again, and now I've been writing, write for the Times now, and and so it's been a way to come back to this older way of like having this deadline and writing 1,500 words about a subject. And so it kind of happens on all these different levels. So, that's a long way to answer your question, but so
it's actually a great answer, because you basically set up all the other questions that I have written down here. So now I just have to figure out what order I'm going to go in. Actually, let's just start with the Times, if that's all right, since you kind of just mentioned that at the end, because that's something that I'm actually like really interested in. When I saw your first piece, I think it was on branding.
On mood boards, right?
Late last year, and I thought I didn't realize that this was kind of a thing that was now a part of your practice. And so I have a couple questions kind of around that, and one is, do you see that as kind of separate from the work that you're doing here at the studio, and then also, how do they kind of relate to each other? And then the second part of that is, I feel like the kind of writing that you're doing there is for a very different audience than the writing that you've done in the past, a much wider audience.
And also the subject I'm writing about is much wider too, because I'm not writing just about graphic design anymore, and I'm trying to write about, in a much broader way about design in general.
But it's interesting also, like I'm thinking of the Homeland typography that starts very kind of pop culture, political, but you kind of go deep into typography in that too. And so
I was about to go back to that, because that's exactly what I wanted to talk about, which was that what I really wanted to do was talk about it in a way that a graphic designer would totally get. Like they would appreciate that I know something about typography, because what I found was really frustrating. A lot of times you'd read these things, it didn't talk about typography in a way that typographers really know, right? It would talk about it like they would talk about fonts or things like that, but it would totally miss the point. And when you read those things, you're like, this is nothing. So I really wanted to try to write about like typography in a really deep way for people who know something about typography, but also let that be open for people who don't know about typography. And so I started to do that in ID a long time ago, and to really, talk about the kind of things that graphic designers talk about, and the subjects that we talk about, and the things that are of interest to us, but then also make that possibly interesting to other people, and so that Arab piece, I think that your analysis is exactly right, which is I wanted to do something to start off that everyone could get, and then get really down to like that typography is a political act, and there's a politics to typography, and that typographers deal with that politics, and so I think that's always been the trick, which is how can you talk about it in a way that a graphic designer or a typographer would appreciate it, but also that someone, they have 3 million readers at the time, so you have to go and like lots of people could read it.
I've loved all. I think you've done 3 probably by this point.
3, I just finished the 4th one, So
and that I've loved all of them, but that one was the one that was my favorite, and I read it multiple times because I was like, how did he do this and navigate that? Because I feel like you were successful in that, in kind of blending that kind of populist kind of conversation with something that was very specific.
Yeah, and I think that's something I'm really thinking about a lot, especially because I'm it's part of the edict for the Times, which is that you have to write for the Times audience, but that I don't want to become this kind of thing where this becomes very bland, but that it's still I'm still writing it from a graphic designer's position, and that there's a knowledge to it, and so I've been thinking a lot about those structural ways to do that, and there's lots of different structural ways to try to get at that, which is that, like in that one, you use something which is non-threatening, and everyone can watch Homeland. They can kind of get what the issue would be, or to talk about things which are familiar enough, that even if you hadn't seen it, you would kind of get the idea of it.
Yeah.
Or to see, like in the first one about branding, that people who don't really think about branding actually dealing with branding all the time. They're just not thinking about it. And so what I wanted to show there was that you're oftentimes on the receiving end of that stuff, but you don't know what the behind the scenes way of people are doing that, and so it's either like revealing the inside, going from the pop to the detail. There's always there's a kind of transformative moment that happens when and so like if you take the Arab one, it goes from a pop thing to a history thing to a methodological thing. And so to first say like, okay, this is something, but actually has a really long history, and this animosity between these two cultures is a long time, and that animosity was exacerbated by technology, and now kids are using technology to undermine it. So you can see these transition points where you go for those things.
Interesting.
And so I think that's really, when you're writing for those kind of audiences, you have to find those turning points, those places where you can kind of click from one story to another somehow.
Last week I talked to Stephen Heller, and we talked about something very similar, because I was asking him about that kind of different publics that he's writing to, and he kind of said a very similar thing of kind of either putting in certain words or turns of phrases that designers would know to kind of let them know he knows what he's talking about, but then removing some sometimes so it doesn't get too bogged down in jargon and things like that. What's that kind of process like?
Well, a lot of that happens with your editor too, because the editor is sort of, in my case, I have a great editor there, and she's basically the representative of the people, right? So she's like, people aren't going to get what you're talking about here, and but I have to say that I haven't had it's been a really very easy relationship with them, and because I think I've thought about the subject for 30 years, so I have like something to say about it, but I think that also the you kind of get a sense of what people will understand, and that piece actually was much longer originally. I think it was probably another 500 words longer than that, and it went into more historical detail, and because I got really into the history, because it's really fascinating actually. There were like these. There was a technological reason that Arab type didn't get set, and a political reason, and the two twined together, right? So part of it was that that there was a kind of resistance to using Western methodology at all, because it seemed wrong, and then another part was that it like physically was hard to do. Like the type didn't give itself to cutting into lead. So you had this kind of weird confluence of technology and politics together.
That's fascinating.
So it went into more detail on that, but she was like, well, I think that it's becoming too much of a history lesson, so so I cut that back a little bit. But she's good at modulating kind of where that should fall, and sometimes sometimes there's parts I'm sad to let go because I'm interested in it and I want to keep going on it, but it's not a place for an academic essay. It's a place for something.
Are you pitching these stories or these ideas, or?
Yeah, we just have lunch, and then I talk about the things I'm thinking about, and she talks about things that she's thinking about, and so and then there are this, like right now I just finished one for women's fashion, and so or like the last one which was on metallics. That was in a beauty issue, so I wanted to write something that would somehow go along with beauty, and so there's themed issues. So like this. This next one's women's fashion, and so I'm writing about retail shopping, and then the next one is about design, and I'm going to write about I'm going to write it as coherence piece. So they somehow mirror what's going on in the issue anyways.
Interesting.
So not it doesn't have to be exactly, but I think that's the interesting thing, which is it forces you to again to put your model, like if you take the metallic one, like can you apply the model to lipstick?
Right.
And if the model works, you should be able to apply it to lipstick, And you should say, okay, lipstick isn't just lipstick. Lipstick's an indication of a bigger cultural moment, and there's a way to read that cultural moment. And if you look at that, you should be able to find reflection of that moment in other things. And so in that one, it starts off with, the Met Ball because it just happened, and then it goes into makeup. and then from makeup it goes into the idea of mechanization, and mechanization into robots into cyborgs back to makeup. So you have like this kind of progression again, you know. So
I don't want to spend too much time on this because there are other things, but I do have one more question, because I loved the metallic piece with just the breadth of examples that you kind of pulled in. How long were you thinking?
It's fun.
What's that research
that piece has
like?
an interesting history, because I wrote a piece almost like five years ago or something like that on disembodied robotic voices. And I thought a lot about, and in fact, I used a little bit of that in this piece because there was a kind of similarity. So it's a subject I thought about already on a different, but in a totally different way on it, you know. But there's a lot of things I just like, you know, I'm kind of constantly trying to observe the world and think about things all the time. And so, you know, when you get old enough, you have a lot of references in your mind.
Right.
Like you've seen a lot of movies already, so it's like, you know, you can pull them out.
How do you see, what's the relationship to that kind of writing to the work that you're doing here at the studio?
One thing I wanted to say about the metallic piece is that we also did the illustrations for that, and I thought that was like another, you know, like, and so that's a kind of interesting thing, which is that those illustrations, we were working on a project for Prada at the time, and we were creating these robot collages, and so it was just this kind of weird parallel about something we were making. We were making robot collages. I was writing about metallics, and they all kind of came together.
So those collages that were in the Times were made specifically.
Well, we made one for specifically for the Times. The other one is actually for Prada.
I saw they were very Prada-esque.
Right.
They seemed like that. I assumed that. I didn't realize they were.
So you know, in a way that parallel. So what I find really interesting, which is that part of what we do now as a studio is we create intelligence for our clients, right? So we're trying to think through cultural situations for them and saying, like, when you do branding, you're trying to think of culture, and you're trying to go figure out how do you fit into it. So to me, like this is a kind of research, a kind of articulation of research that surrounds all the work we're doing right now. Like, so for instance, we've been working on this new retail platform called theline.com, and I wrote this piece on the domestication of shopping, and that's very related to what we're thinking about for them. So there's a lot that, you know, they're very close for me. Like to describe something is the way that you might write when you write something about branding or something, that they would go together somehow, and that one's just a kind of research for the other or something. You know, an articulation.
And it's interesting because it kind of comes back to your studio in Boston, where you said that's when you kind of started writing again, and it came out of stuff that you were actually working on.
Yeah, so if you look at the metallic piece, like, you know, the initial impulse was that Mutual Product, the show, made the lips gold, and I was there, and it was sort of like, oh, that's peculiar. But I was also been working at Financiana Prada, where she gilded her building. So those were two things that I was deeply involved in, and then I just tried to dimensionalize that, like how can we make sense of what we're seeing right now? And that's something that we're involved in. And it's sometimes a little weirdly uncomfortable, like, you know, writing about things that I'm working on and stuff like that. But I think that's actually what's good. It allows me to at least know what I'm talking about to a certain extent. Like, these aren't things I just made up. They're things that actually I know I'm involved in. I know that's happening. You know, and so you know, I try to always disclaim when I'm talking about something I actually was involved in. But I think that you know, that's where I feel like they're really, really deeply entwined for me now. Like all those activities, they're not separate.
Do you write every day?
Yeah. I mean, for some reason, you know, I'm writing memos. I'm writing.
I realize that's a wide.
But you know, I think that it's a really important thing. I'm working. You know, so I work early in the morning when I write. So you know, I usually have the first couple of hours a day when I'm doing that, and then the day gets much busier. But I'm also working on a new book project right now, and so I'm trying to do research on that. And I have someone here working with me on research, and so.
Oh, that's interesting.
So, you know, I try to spend a portion of the day writing something. And it's either I'm working on the next article, or I'm reading, and you know, I'm doing a lot of reading right now because I'm trying to do the research for that book. So it's like, I could just spend like 2 hours just reading for that or something like that. You know? So, but you have to fit that in amongst your work, you know. So it's not so easy.
I want to talk a little bit about your conversation with Rick Pointer about design criticism that was 20 years ago
like
now,
that,
and then
15
and then you did
the
update.
We did an update, right? Yeah.
And I feel like that conversation is kind of continually relevant, but also continually kind of reinventing itself with each. I mean, I feel like I kind of just missed the 90s kind of criticism
period, right? Yeah.
Kind of boom, and I think sometimes I probably look at that with like rose-tinted glasses of this kind of amazing time of intellectual curiosity. But I'm curious, what do you think about today? And there's more discourse around design than ever, as you mentioned, and it's kind of become this. I've heard you say many times that design has moved from kind of like the end of the process to the beginning of the process.
Right, yeah. Which I took directly from Bruno Latour. It's a great article you should read, which is called A Cautious Prometheus. I'll send it to you.
Okay,
But because that's his theory, basically, is that he's analyzing actually the word design itself, and the way that it transforms in terms of where it fits into a process. But yeah, so what do you think? It's switching from an end to a beginning. Yeah.
And so I'm curious, just like as somebody who has kind of been designing and writing through different kind of periods of design, who now is designing at a successful studio and writing for the Times about design in the broadest sense. I don't even really know exactly how. This is a big question, but like, how do you feel about the discourse that's around design right now?
Yeah, I think that it's been a really interesting transformation. I think because if you think about like when I got out of school in the early '80s, design was still very, people still talked about the joke like, oh, my mother doesn't know what I do. This kind of thing. There's this joke, and. It was pretty obscure, and in that way there was a kind of good and bad part about it. Which is the good part was that there was this very tight knit people who knew about it, and then there was kind of fraternity around that. But on the other hand, it seemed like very superfluous kind of work, and that's so different now because everyone's so obsessed with design.
Right.
And what design should do and how design should be part of everything, and and in the sense like. Now you never embark on a project without having a design in place, right? Like and especially because graphic design itself has become such a prevalent medium. I can't emphasize enough how different it is now than it was then in terms of people not only understanding but valuing, wanting, thinking it's important. I mean, it's become like it's a really, really major change that way, and. But on the other hand, I think that in some ways, the more successful it gets, the worse the discourse is, or something like that. Like it's kind of like we're so busy making stuff like no one thinks about talking about it anymore, or something like that. And so I do think there was a period in the '90s when there was an excitement that the idea that theory could have a role to play in it, which I don't feel now so much, and that happened. There's a reason that one reason that happened was that
you don't feel that theory has.
Well, I don't think that there's a feeling of excitement around theory at the moment. I mean, there's excitement about making design because it's like successful, you can make some money on it. But I think that what happened was that theory was hard. First of all, a lot of the texts that were being applied are really difficult texts. That they don't lend themselves. They don't give over their information easily, and I think that there was a sense, too, that the work that was being produced by it was becoming more and more distant from the real world somehow. Yeah. And in the late 90s and the early 2000s, I think there was a move toward, in architecture, what was called the projective practice.
Oh, yeah.
Which is the idea that you should be able to enact your ideas through work, not separately from work, right? The projective practice was, we always have been embraced being a commercial studio. We wanted to make work, but we wanted to try to go and make work which is still interesting and engaging and theoretical in a way, even though it was done for commercial practice.
Yeah.
Right? And so that was the idea, and in a way, the kind of really complicated aspect of theory kind of fell off to a certain extent. And so, I think we're in this position. I'm not sure, like, I mean, you could probably tell me better. Who do you think are like the interesting writers right now about design? Are there young theorists who are doing like interesting work or something?
That's kind of why I'm doing this, is because I'm trying to find that also.
Right. Yeah.
Which is why I also thought it was interesting that you said kind of in the mid '80s when you or when you kind of responded to the print magazine piece, you felt like there was this superficiality and that there was more there. In many ways, that's kind of how I'm feeling now. And, there's a new, a brand redesign or a new logo, and it's just everyone tweets their immediate reaction, and then everyone forgets about it.
And that's part of that is a medium problem, I think, which is that the medium doesn't sustain, and I think the medium doesn't sustain in the sense that, and I'm not a person who's like, oh, it's so bad now, it was so great then, because I think that the medium brings lots of other things to it, but that it favors things which are very short, and it favors things which are very quick, and so it's hard to go back to that stuff or find that there's a kind of density of it or something like that. Even though there's there's like lots of writing going on now because there's blogs and there's there's comments and there's things like that. But it's hard to capture that or something like that to really get at it.
Does that change how you think about the writing that you do?
I guess to a certain extent, but I really feel like I tried as much as possible just to do what I want to do and not try to fit in to a certain I'm not sure I could anyway. So I write the way that I can write, and I try to go and write about things that I think are interesting and to me, and hopefully there's an audience for that. But I never because I never really participated in Facebook or those kinds of tools so much, and I really have an aversion to Twitter. So it really makes me anxious. So it's for me when I go on Twitter, it just makes me feel like all the things that I don't know and haven't seen.
Right. Yeah.
It just makes me feel like and also that I'm really sensitive to comment culture, which I never read the comments to things like that because it really bothers me.
I can't do it either.
Yeah, I take it really personally and I get really offended or hurt or something like that. And so and so that kind of level of meanness and just snarkiness, I think it just doesn't do anything for me. So I just try to ignore it as much as possible. And, I do things because I like to do them and because they're fun to me or they extend my curiosity. But the way that those things become public, I don't like so much.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I think that it's been interesting because Susan's the head of design at the Met, and they went through this rebranding and had this incredible reaction to that, and that really struck me about how just when we first started designing. You never had any reaction to your work ever.
Yeah.
No one would ever know you did it in the first place. And if you designed a logo, if some colleague liked it, that would be great. But this idea that you'd have thousands of people responding to it and having something to say about it is so foreign to me. And when I look at that, I think 95% of it is just misinformed. It doesn't know anything about it. Just and so there's all this noise and blah 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 blah. But when I read through it, I'm like. It's not enlightening. It didn't move me. It didn't change me. It didn't teach me anything. It's just basically a lot of blah blah blah.
My next interview after you is I'm talking to Michael Beirut, and he's written about that phenomenon. And that's one of the main things I want to talk to him about. Also, which I
really respected that, and I really respected actually. I was asked with a bunch of other people to submit a thing on the new Google logo, which I wrote, and I really respected his response, which is I'm not going to do this anymore, and I think I'm going to adopt the same position because I do think that there's this kind of instant commentary that it just doesn't make me happy. If anything, what I've really tried to do in my whole career is think about things really deeply or thoughtfully, and I'm not saying that I'm a deep thinker, but it's just at least that's my aspiration. I'd like to do it in a reasoned way and to think about it and to support it with evidence and have examples of something. And if it's just basically opinion about stuff, it's just so empty to me somehow.
I have just a few more. We're getting short on time, so I just have a few more questions. And I think kind of what you just said about what you try to do, I think you're very successful at that. I talked to Rob Gianpietra also, and he's somebody who I think kind of
I really like his writing.
Writes in a very similar way where he kind of removes himself a little bit and is kind of looking at kind of a wider lens. Just to kind of wrap it up a little bit, and kind of going off of this a little bit is what kind of issues right now kind of in the design profession do you think kind of need greater discourse around them or deeper discourse?
Well, I think that there's talking a little bit about what I'm really interested in right now, which is I'm really interested in the way that design does is design creates these kind of seemingly self-evident, coherent worlds, and that in doing that, by designing them, it makes them feel real, even though they're imaginary. And I'll give you an example, which is that the whole debate in North Carolina around the bathrooms, the whole idea that there's a men's and women's bathroom in its first place is a design decision, right? And that's a design decision that happened a long time ago by kind of gradually, like because there were no divided bathrooms up until the late 19th century. And so at a certain point, you start to get this ideological divide, and it's about protecting women. There's a whole bunch of like weird ideology around it. And then slowly that becomes part of the building code, and then it starts to be that every time you design a building, of course you're going to have a men's and women's room.
Yeah.
That makes that division plausibly self-evident. And what's interesting to me about the whole political thing is that it's used as an example. Then it's like, yeah, but they might go into that other room, and it's like the whole fact there's another room there is a totally imaginary thing. You only believe it because there happened to be designed that. And then, but once that decision's been made, then you can do a whole bunch of things. Like you can design icons for that. You can design tiles. You can design different fixtures. And the more you design, the more fixed those things seem to be, and they become more and more real because they're designed. And so design has this way of kind of cementing the world into the way it is. And then it's only when they have this really big disruption, like what's happening now, that suddenly you're like, oh, wait a minute, that's a total fantasy in the first place. And if you think about branding like that, like branding is a way to take a whole bunch of disparate elements and making them seem coherent as a thing, to the point where you're like, oh, of course, that's like, look at all the stuff that it makes, so it must be real, right? And so, I think that there's this really interesting point where to reverse engineer design process to understand not the way we represent the world, but the way that we make the world, the way that we form the world that people understand, and the way that the things that we do start to make the world's. Again, I use this. I'm looking a lot at this philosopher called Nelson Goodman from Harvard in the 70s, and that's his phrase: plausible self-evidence, and. He writes he has a fantastic chapter on style, which is also, I think, the thing that's totally under-theorized in design. Because style is always seen as, first of all, this complete fake division between form and content. And style is seen as somehow a slightly degraded thing which is added on to something to make it special. But when you think about style is really the lens through which we look at almost everything. And so if you're going to say, like, what a brand is coherent style. What is a body of work? A body of work is somehow that it shares style in a certain way. And but then when you start to think about it, I did this little experiment, which is like, if you Google Russian constructivism, Google image search, you get a whole page of stuff that looks alike. It shares style, right? But it can have wildly different things. Like, next to Malevich, you'll have some ad for a handbag company or something. So the style is this coherent thing that makes all these things come together, and so it has. So I think that this aspect of the way that the work that we make allows people to understand the world, but then they start to believe it. And so how do you know when you're, under the confines of the American highway system or not? It's because their signs are green and they have a certain, interstate typography. And then when you turn off that, suddenly you're outside of that because you're outside of that graphic system. And so it, when you feel safe, when you don't feel safe, when you feel part of something or outside of something, all of those things are just like physical design things, right? And Mark Wigley has an interesting quote about this idea of, there's no world left, there's only design, and it's true. Like there's nothing outside anymore, right? Like everything's been designed. Even wild spaces are designed because we just let them be wild, right? We design the edge, like we define the edges of them, so and so this aspect where we're living in a world where everything's designed, and we can only understand the world through these design things. So that's what, in a way, when you ask me that question, that's what I'm thinking about right now, and that's what I'm really trying to write about.
No, that's interesting. I've been kind of thinking about and working on this essay just for myself about kind of the idea of neutrality and how that relates to defaults and things like that. And that actually is very connected to what I've been thinking about in a way that I hadn't even considered yet.
So and I think, for example, like the default, which is the most highly designed thing you could have, right?
Yeah.
Because, and that's where I think you can't escape the aspect of design anymore. And so if you use that idea of the nature preserve, which I always love that idea, which is like, you think that it's a wild space, but it's wild because the edges have been defined to keep it that way, right?
Yeah.
And so that aspect of what's preserved, what's wild, what's kept, are all design decisions. So I think that this theory of what designers do and the role they play in the world, and when you start to play that out, it starts to have really profound implications.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really interesting. For instance, I compare the development of the Berlin Wall with Trump's wall, for instance, right? With Berlin Wall, up until 2 months before the wall appeared, all the governments denied there would be a wall, even though clearly there was a plan to put one in. Everyone talked about that. But then as soon as the wall is built, which is a design, right? You come up with an idea, you build this thing. Now suddenly you create two worlds, right? Which is where it was one city, now there's two cities, and now the two cities have to become completely two different things just because of this thing, right? And now and then when you take the wall away, suddenly they have to become one city again, So you have and so when Trump talks about the wall has nothing to do with immigration. Everyone knows that because most people come here on overstayed visas. They don't climb over the wall. The wall is purely about a kind of design as a kind of manifestation of a distinction, right?
I see what you mean.
And so it's purely a symbolic act, like a $22 billion symbolic act, because now we're saying this is defined, it's defined in a stronger way.
I didn't think of it that way.
And so I'm really interested in this way, like this engagement of designed objects in the world.
That actually kind of leads into my last question, which is kind of a big question, so hopefully it doesn't take too much time, but I'm curious now, kind of hearing you talk about these things, do you see the work that you do here at 2x4 as a critical and theoretical activity? And the reason I ask that is I'm thinking about, I watched a video of the talk that you gave at RISD late last year, where you kind of put everything in the context of the history of screens, and kind of talk about your interest in that and motivation in that. And it was the best talk. I've watched a bunch of your talks online. That was the best one.
Oh, thank you.
And it seemed, I don't mean to be too reductive, but it seemed like a career manifestation of the ideas that you were arguing in Designer as author a little bit. And so I'm just, to close, if you could just kind of speak on
because I think that, especially when you work for a long time, you always have to try to make sense of what you did, right? And it's a constant revisionist history, because anytime you put together a slideshow, for instance, you're throwing things out, and you're putting other things in that make sense, that you're trying to create coherence again, right? Saying what was totally a mess actually had some coherent thought to it, but I don't see that as a negative thing, as a positive thing. You have to constantly try to make sense of what you're doing, and you have to make sense of by using the examples of what you have. But I think that when you ask me if the work is critical and theoretical, I would say yes, with the caveat of that sounding pretentious, in the sense there's a lot of stuff we do that just for whatever reason, maybe it's banal, or maybe it's we didn't do it well, or maybe we had a bad client, or maybe we missed an opportunity or something like that, it's not everything we want it to be. But I would say, honestly, we try each time to do something, and sometimes that's a really little thing, we want to do an experiment with paper or something sometimes we're getting a really small gratification out of something. Sometimes it's a really big thing, and I think that we've had opportunities to do work which is very clearly authored, where we have a lot of control over every aspect of it, which is a complete representation of our ideology, and then some work which is maybe only 5% of it is that, and that's just the nature of working. And we're not artists, we're working, in a complex economy of people and of desires and needs and things like that. So we're trying to do what we can in that. We're in that grappling. And but I would say that what we try to do is we try to, like I was talking about writing, we try to have a model. We try to apply that model to the work that we're doing, and then we try to see if we can make work which supports that
Right.
somehow, and I think that's a completely ongoing process. Like we're adjusting that all the time, and we're trying to loop in what we learned from last time and do it again and things like that, and also what we see other people doing and understanding like the world in general, and but it's really like something I think that we talk about a lot, and we spend a lot of time really thinking about the work we're doing and what we're trying to achieve by it, and the only thing I say is that, like anybody, we're not successful all the time.
Yeah, right, of course.
But we try hard. So it's the experiment always for us, for the three of us in the very beginning, was to, if you're three people working alone on projects for cultural institutions, you can have a lot of control over what you do. If you're 50 people working on really big, super complicated projects, you only have so much control. And that's not a cop-out, just saying that that's a choice we made, and because we wanted to make things in the world. And I have complete respect for the three people working and making cultural work, and I love that work, and I admire it and everything like that. It's just not the choice we made.
Right.
We made a different choice, and the choice we made was to work this way. And so there's a whole bunch of compromises to come with it. But there's also, I think, real opportunities and benefits to doing that too, and that I think that we've always found it really exhilarating to try to make big things. Somehow beyond the scale of the desktop or something like that.
I love that. I think that this is a great way to kind of wrap it up. Thank you so much for talking with me. This was great.
I look forward to seeing what you.
This episode was recorded on July 14th, 2016 in New York City. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter at Surface Podcast. You can find us on iTunes and SoundCloud and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.